October 2, 1919. The White House, Washington, D.C. Edith Wilson rushed into the bathroom and found her husband collapsed on the floor. President Woodrow Wilson, the man who had led America through World War I, the man who had stood before the kings and leaders of Europe as the savior of civilization, the man whose 14 points had promised a new world order of peace and justice, was lying helpless, the left side of his body completely paralyzed. He had suffered a catastrophic stroke. For the next 17 months, the United States of America had no functioning president. Woodrow Wilson lay in the White House, partially blind, partially paralyzed, unable to perform his duties. His wife Edith made decisions, controlled access, and effectively ran the executive branch of the United States government. The Senate refused to ratify the League of Nations, Wilson's greatest dream, the international organization he believed would prevent all future wars. Wilson refused to compromise. His stubbornness killed the League. 2 years later, a Second World War would begin. 50 million people would die. And Woodrow Wilson, lying broken in the White House, his body destroyed, his dream shattered, would live just long enough to see everything he had fought for collapse. This is the story of Woodrow Wilson, a story of academic brilliance and political genius, of moral certainty and catastrophic rigidity, of a man who genuinely wanted to save the world and whose personal failures helped destroy it. His life would be marked by intellectual triumph and physical tragedy, by revolutionary idealism and profound racism, by the greatest foreign policy vision in American history and the most devastating personal failure. This is not just the story of a president. This is the story of a man who stood at the hinge point of history and both saved civilization and failed it, sometimes in the same moment. This is the story of Woodrow Wilson, early life and the making of a scholar, December 28, 1856, Stanton, Virginia. Thomas Woodrow Wilson was born in a Presbyterian manse, the home of a minister, in Stanton, Virginia, the third of 4 children of Joseph Ruggles Wilson and Janet Jessie Woodrow Wilson. His father was a distinguished Presbyterian minister and theologian, deeply respected throughout the Southern Church. Young Tommy Wilson, he went by Tommy until he was a young man, grew up in the heart of the Confederacy during the Civil War and Reconstruction. His earliest memories were of wounded Confederate soldiers being treated in his father's church, of seeing captured Union soldiers march through the streets, of watching his father pray for Confederate victory. The Wilson family was deeply Southern, deeply Presbyterian, and deeply shaped by the trauma of defeat. Joseph Wilson served as a chaplain to Confederate forces, and the family's sympathies were entirely with the lost cause. These childhood experiences would shape Woodrow Wilson's racial attitudes in ways that would define and taint his entire presidency. Tommy Wilson was a late developer. He didn't learn to read until he was 10 years old, likely because of an undiagnosed learning disability that we would now recognize as dyslexia. He struggled with letters and numbers in ways that frustrated his brilliant father. But Joseph Wilson was patient and supportive, drilling his son in rhetoric, composition, and argumentation. Father and son spent hours together, the elder Wilson teaching Tommy how to construct arguments, how to write precisely, how to speak persuasively. It was the most important education Wilson ever received. Everything else, every academic achievement, every political speech, every presidential proclamation, would flow from those hours with his father learning how to use words as weapons and tools. Once Wilson learned to read, he read everything. He discovered a passion for history, politics, and political philosophy. He became fascinated with great leaders and their methods, particularly parliamentary leaders like William Gladstone and Edmund Burke, men who governed through persuasion, eloquence, and moral authority. Wilson decided at a young age that he would be a great statesman. He practiced speeches in his room, debated imaginary opponents, and dreamed of leading his nation. In 1873, at age 16, Wilson briefly attended Davidson College in North Carolina. He was sickly, suffered from chronic digestive problems and nervous exhaustion, and withdrew after 1 year. He spent nearly 2 years at home before entering Princeton University in 1875. At Princeton, then called the College of New Jersey, Wilson finally flourished. He discovered debate, politics, and the life of the mind. He was not a distinguished student academically, but he was a passionate writer and debater who found his voice. Wilson graduated from Princeton in 1879 and entered the University of Virginia Law School. He hated it. Law was dry, technical, and detail-oriented, everything Wilson disliked. He was interested in the big picture of governance, not the minutiae of contracts and precedents. Wilson left law school without completing his degree and spent years practicing law in Atlanta. He was a mediocre lawyer with almost no clients, deeply unhappy. In 1883, Wilson made the decision that would change everything. He enrolled in the graduate program in history and political science at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. He would become not a lawyer or politician, but a scholar. It was the right decision. Wilson was a brilliant scholar. He wrote his doctoral dissertation on congressional government, a sophisticated analysis of how Congress actually worked compared to the Constitution's design. It was published as a book in 1885 and became an immediate academic sensation, establishing Wilson as one of America's foremost political scientists at age 28. ELLEN, marriage, and academic glory. While at Johns Hopkins, Wilson fell deeply and passionately in love with Ellen Louise Axson, the daughter of a Georgia Presbyterian minister. Ellen was intelligent, artistic, sensitive, and deeply religious. She was everything Wilson needed: patient, devoted, and able to manage his volatile temperament and frequent bouts of depression and nervous collapse. They married on June 24, 1885, and over the next 12 years had 3 daughters: Margaret, 1886, Jessie, 1887, and Eleanor, 1889. Wilson adored Ellen and depended on her completely. She was his emotional anchor, his intellectual companion, and his most trusted advisor. Wilson began his academic career teaching at Bryn Mawr College in Pennsylvania. He was an inspired teacher, passionate, eloquent, and demanding. Students found his lectures electrifying. He made politics and history come alive. He moved to Wesleyan University in Connecticut in 1888, then to Princeton in 1890. At Princeton, Wilson became the most celebrated professor in the university, drawing hundreds of students to his lectures on constitutional government and American history. Wilson published continuously, essays, books, and articles establishing him as the preeminent scholar of American government and politics. His multi-volume History of the American People reached a wide popular audience. His essays on leadership and governance were widely read by politicians and intellectuals. But Wilson was not content to be merely a scholar. He wanted power. He wanted to put his ideas into practice. He wanted to govern. In 1902, the Princeton Board of Trustees unanimously elected Wilson as president of the university. He was 45 years old and ready to lead. Princeton and the taste of power. Wilson's presidency of Princeton University was simultaneously his greatest academic achievement and his first major experience of the personal rigidity and stubbornness that would later destroy his greatest political dreams. Wilson transformed Princeton from a pleasant country club for wealthy young men into a serious academic institution. He reorganized the curriculum, established the preceptorial system of small group tutorials, raised academic standards dramatically, and recruited distinguished faculty. Princeton's academic reputation soared. Wilson was celebrated as one of the great university reformers of his generation. But Wilson also fought bitter battles that he refused to compromise on, even when compromise might have produced better outcomes. The Quad Plan controversy of 1907 was instructive. Wilson proposed abolishing Princeton's eating clubs, elite social organizations that divided students by class and wealth, and replacing them with residential quadrangles where students of all backgrounds would live and dine together. It was a genuinely progressive idea. But Wilson's insistence on total victory rather than partial reform, his refusal to compromise with trustees and alumni who opposed the plan, and his personal attacks on those who disagreed with him created bitter enemies. The Quad Plan failed. Wilson was humiliated. An even more bitter battle followed over the location of Princeton's graduate school. Wilson clashed ferociously with Dean Andrew Fleming West over whether the graduate school should be integrated into the main campus or built at a distance. Wilson lost this battle too, and after years of fighting, his position at Princeton became untenable. But his battles at Princeton had made him famous as a fighter for democratic education and against privilege. Democratic Party bosses in New Jersey decided that Wilson's name recognition and reformist reputation made him an ideal candidate for governor of New Jersey in 1910. Wilson accepted the nomination. He had never run for political office in his life. Within 2 years, he would be President of the United States. The rise to politics, Wilson was elected governor of New Jersey in November 1910 by a comfortable margin. The Democratic bosses who had nominated him expected a compliant figurehead who would do what they told him. They were catastrophically wrong. Within days of his inauguration, Wilson turned on the very bosses who had put him in office. He fought for direct election of senators, workers' compensation laws, utility regulation, and election reform, against the opposition of the very political machine that had elected him. Wilson won every battle. In 2 years as governor of New Jersey, he transformed the state and established himself as the most dynamic reform governor in America. The 1912 Democratic National Convention in Baltimore became one of the most dramatic in American history. Wilson was a leading candidate for the presidential nomination, but he faced fierce opposition from the party's conservative wing. For 46 ballots, no candidate could secure a majority. Finally, on the 46th ballot, 3-time presidential candidate William Jennings Bryan, the most powerful figure in Democratic politics, switched his support to Wilson. The switch broke the deadlock. On the 46th ballot, Woodrow Wilson became the Democratic nominee for president. The 1912 general election was extraordinary. The Republican Party had split between President William Howard Taft and Theodore Roosevelt's progressive Bull Moose Party. With the Republican vote divided, the Democratic candidate was almost certain to win. Wilson campaigned on the New Freedom, a program of progressive reform focused on restoring competition and opportunity against the power of trusts and monopolies. He was an electrifying speaker who connected intellectual arguments to moral conviction. On November 5, 1912, Woodrow Wilson won the presidency with 435 electoral votes, though only 41.8% of the popular vote. The Republican split had given him the White House. Woodrow Wilson, age 56, born in Virginia, former professor and university president, had become the first Democratic president since Grover Cleveland and the first Southerner in the White House since Reconstruction. He arrived with enormous ambitions and a detailed plan for reform. He was about to change America and then attempt to change the world. The New Freedom domestic revolution, Wilson's first term, was a stunning legislative achievement. No president since perhaps Abraham Lincoln had pushed through as much significant legislation as Wilson did in 1913 and 1914. The Federal Reserve Act, 1913. America's banking system was chaotic and prone to financial panics. There was no central bank, no lender of last resort, no way to provide liquidity during economic crises. Wilson worked with Congress to pass the Federal Reserve Act in December 1913, creating the Federal Reserve System, a network of 12 regional banks overseen by a Federal Reserve Board that would regulate the money supply and serve as a lender of last resort. It was one of the most consequential economic reforms in American history. The Federal Reserve System still exists today, managing America's monetary policy and serving as the backbone of the American financial system. The Underwood Tariff, 1913. Wilson pushed through the first significant reduction in tariffs since the Civil War, reducing the average tariff rate from 41% to 27%. To compensate for lost revenue, the new federal income tax, enabled by the 16th Amendment, ratified just before Wilson took office, was implemented for the first time. The Clayton Antitrust Act, 1914. Wilson strengthened antitrust law by passing the Clayton Act, which prohibited specific anti-competitive practices and, crucially, exempted labor unions from antitrust prosecution, a major victory for organized labor. The Federal Trade Commission, 1914. Wilson created the Federal Trade Commission to investigate and stop unfair business practices, establishing a permanent regulatory agency to police corporate behavior. In just 2 years, Wilson had reformed the banking system, reduced tariffs, established the income tax, strengthened antitrust law, and created a permanent regulatory framework for American business. It was a legislative achievement of remarkable scope and speed. But as Wilson's domestic achievements mounted, a catastrophe was building in Europe that would overwhelm everything. The war in Europe and American neutrality. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary was assassinated in Sarajevo by a Serbian nationalist. Within 6 weeks, the chain reaction of European alliances had plunged the continent into the most catastrophic war in history. World War I, the Great War, consumed Europe with terrifying speed and violence. Millions of men were slaughtered in the trenches of France and Belgium. The industrial machinery of modern warfare produced casualties on an unimaginable scale. Wilson declared American neutrality immediately. The United States must be neutral in fact as well as in name, Wilson proclaimed. He believed America's role was to serve as an impartial mediator, preserving peace and eventually helping broker a settlement. But maintaining neutrality was enormously difficult. Britain and France needed American supplies, credit, and weapons. Germany needed America to stay out. Both sides tried to manipulate American public opinion and policy. The greatest crisis came from German submarine warfare. Germany declared the waters around Britain a war zone and threatened to sink any ship, including neutral American vessels, that carried supplies to Britain. On May 7, 1915, a German submarine torpedoed the British ocean liner RMS Lusitania off the coast of Ireland. The Lusitania sank in 18 minutes. Over 1,100 people died, including 128 Americans. America was outraged. Theodore Roosevelt and others demanded immediate war with Germany. Wilson refused. He sent sharp diplomatic notes demanding that Germany respect neutral shipping rights. Germany temporarily backed down, but Wilson's restraint earned him an unexpected political benefit. In 1916, Wilson ran for re-election on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." The American people, horrified by European carnage, wanted to stay out of the conflict. Wilson won re-election by the narrowest of margins, 277 electoral votes to Republican Charles Evans Hughes's 254. It was the last time Wilson would keep America out of the war. Personal tragedy and second love before his re-election, Wilson had experienced the most devastating personal blow of his life. Ellen Wilson had been declining in health throughout 1914. She suffered from Bright's disease, a kidney condition that weakened her steadily. Despite the best medical care available, Ellen grew weaker throughout the spring of 1914. On August 6, 1914, just days after World War I began, Ellen Wilson died in the White House. She was 48 years old. Wilson was shattered. He wept uncontrollably at Ellen's bedside. He fell into a deep depression that alarmed his doctors and advisors. He told friends he hoped he would be assassinated so he could be with Ellen. "God has stricken me almost beyond what I can bear," Wilson wrote. Ellen had been Wilson's emotional foundation for 29 years. Without her, he was lost, vulnerable, lonely, and desperately unhappy. Then, in March 1915, Wilson met Edith Bolling Galt, a 42-year-old widow who ran a successful jewelry store in Washington. Edith was beautiful, vivacious, sophisticated, and utterly unlike the quiet, scholarly Ellen. Wilson fell in love with bewildering speed. He wrote Edith love letters almost daily. He proposed marriage within months of their first meeting. His advisors were alarmed. It had been only a year since Ellen's death. A rapid remarriage would seem disrespectful to Ellen's memory and politically damaging before the 1916 election. Wilson didn't care. He needed Edith. He was drowning without her. On December 18, 1915, Woodrow Wilson and Edith Bolling Galt married at her home in Washington. Edith became Wilson's constant companion, his protector, and ultimately the person who would shield him from the world when his health collapsed. Their marriage was loving and genuine, but it was also unequal in ways that would have profound consequences. Edith was devoted to Wilson personally, but had no background in government or policy. When Wilson's stroke left him incapacitated, Edith's protection would shade into something approaching unauthorized executive power. America enters the Great War in January 1917. Germany made a fateful decision. Desperate to break the stalemate, Germany announced it would resume unrestricted submarine warfare, attacking all ships, including neutral American vessels. It was a calculated gamble. Germany believed it could starve Britain into submission before America could mobilize and deploy troops to Europe. The gamble was catastrophic. Then came the Zimmermann telegram. British intelligence intercepted and decoded a secret German telegram from Foreign Secretary Arthur Zimmermann to the German ambassador in Mexico, proposing a military alliance. If America entered the war, Germany would help Mexico reconquer Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. When the Zimmermann telegram was published in American newspapers in March 1917, the American public was furious. German submarines were sinking American ships. Germany was secretly plotting to help Mexico attack American territory. German-American relations collapsed. On April 2, 1917, Woodrow Wilson stood before a joint session of Congress and asked for a declaration of war against Germany. His speech was one of the greatest in American presidential history. It is a fearful thing to lead this great peaceful people into war, into the most disastrous and dismal of all wars. Civilization itself seeming to be in the balance. But the right is more precious than peace, and we shall fight for the things which we have always carried nearest our hearts, for democracy, for the right of those who submit to authority to have a voice in their own governments, for the rights and liberties of small nations. The world must be made safe for democracy. Congress declared war on Germany on April 6, 1917. The United States had entered World War I. Wilson moved with remarkable speed to mobilize America's enormous industrial and military potential. The Selective Service Act created a draft that eventually conscripted 2.8 million men. War industries were organized and directed. War bonds were sold. American forces, called the Dobas, began arriving in France under General John "Black Jack" Pershing in 1917. By 1918, over 2 million American soldiers were fighting in France. The American intervention tipped the balance decisively. Germany and its allies were exhausted. Fresh American troops poured into the line just as German offensives were running out of strength. On November 11, 1918, at 11 a.m., the armistice took effect. World War I was over. Over 17 million people had died. Wilson had led America to victory. Now he would try to win the peace. The 14 Points and the Paris Peace Conference before the war even ended. Wilson had proclaimed his vision for the post-war world. On January 8, 1918, Wilson delivered his 14-point speech to Congress, laying out the principles that should govern the peace settlement. The 14 points included freedom of the seas for all nations in peace and war, free trade and the removal of economic barriers between nations, reduction of armaments by all nations to the lowest point consistent with domestic safety, self-determination of peoples. Every nationality should have the right to govern itself. Open diplomacy, no secret treaties or agreements between nations. And most importantly, the 14th point, calling for the creation of a League of Nations, an international organization that would guarantee the territorial integrity and political independence of all nations. The League of Nations was Wilson's supreme idea, his vision for preventing all future wars through collective security. If all nations joined a league and agreed to defend each other against aggression, no aggressor would dare attack because it would face the combined power of all other nations. It was a revolutionary vision. It was also, in essence, the blueprint for what would eventually become the United Nations. When Wilson announced the 14 points, the response was extraordinary. Across Europe and throughout the world, oppressed peoples cheered. German socialists and moderates used Wilson's points as a basis for negotiating the armistice. Poles, Czechs, Hungarians, Arabs, and dozens of other nationalities looked to Wilson as their liberator. When Wilson sailed to Paris in December 1918 to personally attend the Paris Peace Conference, the first sitting president ever to travel to Europe, the reception was beyond anything in modern history. In Paris, Rome, London, and every city he passed through, millions of people lined the streets screaming his name. They threw flowers. They wept with joy. They called him the Prince of Peace, the Savior of humanity, the Moses of the New World. Woodrow Wilson, professor from Virginia, stood at the peak of world power. No American president before or since has commanded such universal adoration from the peoples of the world. It was the greatest moment of Wilson's life, and it was about to become his greatest catastrophe. Paris Peace Conference, the betrayal of idealism, the Paris Peace Conference, which ran from January to June 1919, was the most important diplomatic gathering since the Congress of Vienna a century earlier. It would redraw the map of the world and determine the fate of hundreds of millions of people. Wilson arrived with his 14 points. He faced three of the most experienced and ruthless politicians in Europe: British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, French Premier Georges Clemenceau, and Italian Prime Minister Vittorio Orlando. They called themselves the Big Four, but the real battles were between Wilson and Clemenceau, the idealist American professor and the cynical French tiger who had watched his country nearly destroyed twice by German invasion. Clemenceau had no interest in Wilson's idealism. France had lost 1.4 million soldiers dead. Much of northern France lay devastated. Clemenceau wanted Germany crushed, disarmed, financially ruined, and permanently incapable of making war again. "God gave us the 10 Commandments and we broke them," Clemenceau said privately. "Wilson gave us the 14 points. We shall see." The negotiations were brutal. Wilson was forced to compromise on point after point. Self-determination was applied to some nationalities but not others. Colonial peoples, Africans, Asians, Arabs, were ignored entirely, their aspirations dismissed as irrelevant. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919, contained some of Wilson's ideas. The League of Nations was created. New nations were formed from the ruins of the old empires, but it also contained provisions that violated almost everything Wilson stood for. Germany was forced to accept sole responsibility for the war, the infamous War Guilt Clause. Germany was stripped of territory, disarmed, and forced to pay enormous reparations, eventually set at 132 billion gold marks. The reparations were punitive beyond any economic logic. They devastated the German economy, humiliated the German people, and created the resentments that Adolf Hitler would exploit. Wilson knew the treaty was unjust. He was exhausted, ill, and had compromised on everything except the League of Nations. The League, he believed, would eventually fix the treaty's injustices. Nations could appeal to the League, renegotiate terms, resolve disputes peacefully. The League of Nations was Wilson's consolation, his assurance that even a flawed peace could be made just over time. But to create the League, Wilson had to accept the unjust peace, and then he had to go home and persuade the United States Senate to ratify it. The battle for the League. Wilson returned to America in July 1919, exhausted from months of grueling negotiations, in declining health, but still convinced that the League of Nations would save civilization. He faced a formidable obstacle. The United States Senate, controlled by Republicans, was deeply skeptical of the League. Their leader was Senator Henry Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts, Wilson's most brilliant and determined enemy. Lodge was not an isolationist. He didn't oppose American international engagement. What he opposed was surrendering American sovereignty to an international organization without Senate oversight. Specifically, Lodge objected to Article X of the League Covenant, which committed member nations to defend each other's territorial integrity against aggression. Lodge feared Article X would commit America to war without congressional approval, a violation of the Constitution's war powers. Lodge proposed a series of reservations, modifications to the League Covenant that would protect American sovereignty. Many of his reservations were reasonable. Several moderate Republican senators were willing to vote for the treaty with reservations. Wilson needed 67 Senate votes to ratify the treaty. With Democratic votes and moderate Republican support, ratification with reservations was achievable. Wilson refused. Any reservations, Wilson insisted, would emasculate the treaty and destroy the League. America must join the League unconditionally, exactly as negotiated in Paris, or not at all. Wilson would not compromise. He could not compromise. His entire moral framework demanded purity. Half measures were worse than nothing. Wilson's advisors begged him to accept Lodge's reservations. They pointed out that most allied nations would accept modified American participation. They argued that a league with America was infinitely better than a league without America. Wilson refused. Instead, Wilson decided to go over the Senate's head and appeal directly to the American people. He would barnstorm the country, giving speeches in every major city, building public pressure so overwhelming that the Senate would be forced to ratify. It was a desperate gamble, and it would kill him. The Great Tour and the collapse in September 1919. Despite warnings from his doctor that he was in dangerously poor health, Wilson began a grueling national speaking tour. In 22 days, he traveled 8,000 miles by train and gave 40 speeches in 29 cities. Wilson spoke with passionate conviction. He described the League of Nations as the only alternative to another world war. He begged audiences to pressure their senators. He warned that if America rejected the League, within a generation another war would come, and this time it would be even more devastating. His audiences were moved. Some cities gave him enormous, enthusiastic crowds. It seemed the public was responding, but Wilson was breaking down physically. He had suffered from severe headaches and fatigue throughout the Paris negotiations. As the speaking tour progressed, his symptoms worsened dramatically. He began losing sensation in his hands. His headaches became agonizing. He could barely sleep. On September 25, 1919, after a speech in Pueblo, Colorado, Wilson collapsed on the train. His face was contorted, he was weeping, and he could barely walk. His doctor, Carrie Grayson, immediately canceled the rest of the tour and rushed the presidential train back to Washington. 1 week later, on October 2, 1919, Wilson suffered the massive stroke that left him partially paralyzed. The President of the United States was incapacitated, and nobody outside the inner circle knew how serious it was. Edith's regency. What followed was one of the most extraordinary and constitutionally problematic episodes in American history. Woodrow Wilson lay in the White House, partially paralyzed, his vision severely impaired, his mental capacity diminished, his emotional state volatile and unpredictable. He could sit up for only a few hours a day. He could not attend cabinet meetings. He could not meet with senators or foreign dignitaries, but he refused to resign. And Edith Wilson refused to let anyone replace him. Edith became the gatekeeper to the president. No official document, no cabinet decision, no visitor reached Wilson without going through Edith first. She decided what issues were important enough to disturb him, summarized documents for him, and conveyed his responses, or what she claimed were his responses, to the outside world. Edith herself said she was only a stewardship, not making policy decisions herself, but merely protecting Wilson's ability to make them. But the reality was more complex. Wilson was clearly incapable of exercising presidential duties for months. Edith, with no government experience, no democratic mandate, and no constitutional authority, was effectively making decisions for the executive branch of the United States. Cabinet members were desperate. Secretary of State Robert Lansing began convening cabinet meetings without Wilson, and was fired by Wilson for it when Wilson eventually recovered enough to learn what had happened. Senators demanded to see Wilson to assess his condition. They were refused. Vice President Thomas Marshall, who should have assumed presidential duties, was kept in the dark about the severity of Wilson's condition. The 25th Amendment, which provides procedures for presidential disability, would not be ratified until 1967. In 1919, there was no mechanism to remove an incapacitated president who refused to step down. America drifted, leaderless, through one of the most critical periods in its history. And the League of Nations battle continued without its champion. Defeat of the League from his sickbed, Wilson continued to insist on unconditional ratification of the treaty and the League. When Democratic senators, desperate to save some version of the League, begged Wilson to accept Lodge's reservations, Wilson refused. "I will not play the part of a coward," Wilson told his doctor. On November 19, 1919, the Senate voted on the treaty twice, once with Lodge's reservations, once without. Both versions failed. In March 1920, the Senate voted again. Moderate Democratic senators, recognizing that unconditional ratification was impossible, prepared to vote for the treaty with reservations. Wilson wrote to Democratic senators ordering them to vote against the treaty with reservations. They obeyed. The treaty failed again, this time with enough Democratic votes to pass if Wilson had allowed compromise. Woodrow Wilson, in his stubbornness, in his moral certainty, in his inability to accept half a loaf, had killed his own greatest achievement. The United States never joined the League of Nations. Without American participation, the League was weak and ineffective. It failed to stop Japanese aggression in Manchuria, Italian aggression in Ethiopia, or German rearmament under Hitler. On September 1, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. World War II began. 50 million people would die. Wilson had been right that without the League, another war would come. He had been unable to accept the compromises that might have saved the League. In 1920, Warren G. Harding won the presidential election in a Republican landslide, and the era of Wilson's idealism ended. Final years and death. Wilson served out the remainder of his term in the White House, partially disabled and increasingly bitter. He was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1919, one of the most ironic awards in Nobel history, given that the peace he had helped negotiate planted the seeds of an even greater war. On March 4, 1921, Wilson left the White House for the last time. He and Edith retired to a townhouse on S Street in Washington's Kalorama neighborhood. Wilson's physical condition was pitiable. He walked with a cane, his left side partially paralyzed. He was nearly blind in one eye. He tired easily and could manage only limited activity each day. But his mind remained active, and his bitterness was immense. He believed history would vindicate him. He believed the world would eventually recognize that his vision had been right and that his enemies, Lodge, the Senate, the Republican Party, had betrayed civilization itself. Some admirers still came to pay their respects. On Armistice Day, November 11, 1923, a crowd gathered outside his S Street home. Wilson appeared briefly at the door, leaning on his cane, and spoke a few words. Then he turned back inside, broken and old. In the last months of his life, Wilson's health deteriorated rapidly. He could barely leave his bed. He suffered from kidney problems, heart disease, and the ongoing effects of his stroke. On February 1, 1924, Wilson's doctor told him he was dying. Wilson received the news calmly. "I'm a broken piece of machinery," Wilson said. "When the machinery is broken, I am ready." On February 3, 1924, Woodrow Wilson died quietly in his sleep at his S Street home. He was 67 years old. His funeral was simple. His body lay in state briefly. He was buried in the Washington National Cathedral, the only president buried in Washington, D.C., where he rests today. Edith Wilson survived her husband by nearly 4 decades, dying in 1961 at age 89. Legacy. Woodrow Wilson's legacy is one of the most contested and contradictory in American history. His achievements. Wilson was one of the most consequential domestic reformers in presidential history. The Federal Reserve, the income tax, the Clayton Antitrust Act, the Federal Trade Commission. These were transformative reforms that shaped the American economy for a century. Wilson led America through World War I with remarkable effectiveness, mobilizing American industrial and military power with unprecedented speed. American intervention decisively ended the war. Wilson's vision, self-determination, collective security, international law, the League of Nations, was genuinely revolutionary. The United Nations, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the entire architecture of the post-war international order was built on Wilson's ideas. Every international institution created after 1945 to promote peace and cooperation is in some sense, a child of Woodrow Wilson's vision. His failures. Wilson's greatest failure was his inability to compromise on the League of Nations. His stubbornness, born of moral certainty and physical illness, killed his greatest achievement and arguably contributed to the conditions that led to World War II. Wilson was also a committed racist, whose administration represented a major step backward for African Americans. He segregated the federal government, reversing progress made during and after the Civil War. Federal offices in Washington, which had been integrated since Reconstruction, were re-segregated under Wilson. Black federal employees were demoted or fired. Separate bathrooms, cafeterias, and workspaces were established. When black leaders protested, Wilson dismissed them contemptuously. He had grown up in the Confederate South and never questioned the racial hierarchy of that world. Wilson's vision of self-determination applied to European peoples, but explicitly excluded colonial peoples, Africans, Asians, and Arabs, whose aspirations for independence he ignored or dismissed. The Paris Peace Conference, under Wilson's nominal leadership, imposed a settlement that violated Wilson's own principles and planted the seeds of World War II. The humiliation of Germany, the broken promises to colonize peoples, the betrayal of Arab independence, all flowed from the peace conference that Wilson attended as the world's savior. The Wilsonian paradox. Wilson gave the world its most powerful vision of international peace and justice, and then failed to achieve it. He proclaimed self-determination while presiding over racial segregation. He sought to make the world safe for democracy while denying democracy's promises to millions of Americans. He was a man of towering intellect and moral vision who was ultimately defeated by his own rigidity, his own racism, and his own physical frailty at the moment of supreme crisis. "Tell me what is right and I'll fight for it," Wilson once said. The tragedy was that he was sometimes wrong about what was right, and always too certain that he was. Wilson's final assessment of his own legacy was clear. 2 weeks before his death, he whispered to Edith, "I am not sorry I broke down. As it was, I went as far as I could. I would rather fail in a cause that will ultimately triumph than triumph in a cause that will ultimately fail." He was broken, beaten, and dying, but he still believed he had been right. This is the legacy of Woodrow Wilson, the professor who became a president, the idealist who won a world war and tried to end all wars, the visionary who gave the world its greatest framework for peace and then watched it crumble because he couldn't bend, the man who proclaimed the world must be made safe for democracy while making his own government unsafe for Black Americans, the man whose greatest achievement, the League of Nations, died because he refused to compromise, the man who stood at the hinge of history and both saved civilization and failed it. This is the story of Woodrow Wilson,